Rain fell hard on the metal roofs of Ostrenvale, and the sound of it echoed through the fortress like 1,000 tiny drums. Inside the great arena, no rain touched the ground, but the air still felt heavy, wet, and cold. A crowd of aliens stood around a tall fence made of thick steel bars, watching a creature that most of them feared more than they feared death itself. His name was Drakos. He was a war dragon, larger than any building in the fortress, with scales that shined like dark metal under the lights. His wings were folded tight against his back, and his long tail moved slowly across the stone floor, leaving deep scratches behind. His eyes were a burning orange, and when he looked at someone, it felt like he was looking straight into their soul. For years, warriors from many worlds had come to Ostrenvale hoping to become his rider. It was said that whoever could bond with Drakos would become the strongest fighter in the whole empire. But no one had ever succeeded. Every single warrior who entered his cage was either thrown aside, burned by his breath, or simply ignored like they were nothing. Today was no different. A tall alien warrior named Rhodus, covered in battle armor and holding a long spear, walked into the arena with confidence. He believed he was different from the others. He had trained for this moment his entire life. The crowd cheered as he raised his spear high, showing off his strength. Drakos did not even turn his head at first. He stayed still, staring at the wall, as if the warrior was not even there. Rhodus took this as weakness and stepped closer, shouting his war cry, trying to prove his courage. That was his mistake. In one quick motion, Drakos swung his tail and knocked Rhodus off his feet, sending him flying across the arena. The crowd gasped. Guards rushed in to pull the injured warrior away before the dragon could do any real damage. Rhodus was alive, but his pride was shattered, along with 2 of his ribs. Among the crowd watching this scene was a human named Daniel. Unlike the others, he was not cheering or laughing at the fallen warrior. He stood quietly near the back, wearing a simple gray uniform that showed he was just a repair worker, not a fighter. Most of the aliens in the fortress barely noticed him. To them, humans were weak, small, and not worth much attention. Daniel had grown used to being ignored, and honestly, he preferred it that way. But as he watched Drakos walk back to the corner of his cage, something caught his eye. The dragon moved slower than before, favoring one side of his body. Daniel noticed a strange stiffness in the way Drakos lowered himself to the ground, like an old injury was bothering him. No one else in the crowd seemed to notice. They were all too busy talking about Rhodus and his failure. Daniel had spent the last 2 years working as a technician in Ostrenvale, fixing broken machines, patching up damaged walls, and doing small jobs that no one else wanted to do. Before coming here, he had studied basic field medicine back on Earth, though he never became a full doctor. Still, he knew enough to recognize pain when he saw it, whether in a person or, apparently, in a giant dragon. He watched as Drakos curled up in the corner of his massive pen, his wings drooping low. The dragon let out a deep, tired breath, and for a moment, his fierce orange eyes looked almost sad. Daniel had never seen anyone look at Drakos and think of him as anything other than a weapon or a monster. But in that instant, Daniel saw something different. He saw a creature that was hurting, both in body and in something deeper. As the crowd slowly left the arena, talking loudly about the failed attempt, Daniel stayed behind for a moment longer than he should have. He looked at the thick bars separating him from the dragon and wondered what kind of life Drakos had lived before coming to this fortress. No one really knew his full story. All anyone talked about was his power, his size, and how many warriors he had rejected or hurt. A voice called out from behind him. It was Commander Threll, an older alien officer who oversaw the fortress operations. He looked tired, the kind of tired that came from years of watching the same failure happen again and again. "You should not linger here," Threll said, his voice rough. "This is not a place for someone like you." Daniel nodded politely and turned to leave, but he glanced back one more time at Drakos. The dragon had shifted slightly, and for just a second, his orange eyes met Daniel's. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it left Daniel with a strange feeling in his chest, like something important had just happened, even if he could not explain what it was. As he walked back to his small quarters that night, Daniel could not stop thinking about the way Drakos had held his body, the stiffness, the tiredness in his eyes. He decided he wanted to know more about this dragon, not because he wanted to become a rider or prove his strength, but simply because he could not shake the feeling that Drakos was suffering in ways no one else could see. Little did Daniel know, this simple curiosity would soon change both of their lives forever. Deep within the lower levels of Austronvale, where the fortress kept its old records and forgotten files, dust-covered shelves that had not been touched in years, Daniel had asked around quietly, careful not to draw attention, trying to learn more about Drakos and where he had come from. Most of the alien staff either did not know or did not care. To them, the dragon was simply a weapon waiting to be used. But Daniel was not satisfied with that answer. After days of searching, an old data pad finally gave him something useful. It was a report written many years ago, before Austronvale even existed as a fortress. The report spoke of a creature captured from a distant world, a young dragon taken from his family and forced into service by an empire long gone, one that no longer existed after a great war. Drakos had been trained through pain. His trainers used shock collars, starvation, and cruelty to force him into obedience. Anyone who tried to ride him back then did not care about him as a living being. They only wanted a weapon that could fly and burn entire cities to the ground. Daniel sat alone in the dim light of the archive room, reading through page after page. The more he read, the more his stomach twisted with anger and sadness. Drakos was not simply a wild, dangerous beast. He was a survivor of years of abuse, someone who had learned that every single person who came near him only wanted to use him for their own gain. This explained everything. It explained why Drakos rejected warrior after warrior, no matter how strong or skilled they were. It was not random anger. It was self-protection. He was testing them, whether he realized it or not, searching for someone who did not want to control him, someone who did not see him as a tool. The next morning, Daniel made his way back toward the arena, but instead of standing with the crowd, he took a longer path that led to the maintenance tunnels near the dragon's private pen. As a repair technician, he had access to areas most people never bothered to visit. The tunnels were quiet, filled with old pipes and wires that needed constant fixing. From a small gap in the wall, Daniel could see into part of Drakos's resting area, away from the noisy arena where warriors usually approached him. Here, the dragon looked different. His guard seemed lower. He lay curled up, his large body rising and falling slowly with each breath. Daniel noticed thick metal plates bolted onto parts of his side, plates that looked less like armor and more like something forced onto him to hide older wounds underneath. Carefully, without making much noise, Daniel worked on a nearby broken pipe, just close enough to observe without causing alarm. As he worked, he began to hum softly, an old habit from his childhood back on Earth, something he did without even thinking about it. It was a simple, calm tune, nothing special, but it filled the quiet tunnel with a bit of warmth. To his surprise, Drakos lifted his head slightly, turning it toward the sound. His orange eyes locked onto Daniel through the gap in the wall. For a moment, Daniel froze, unsure if he had made a mistake. But the dragon did not growl or show his teeth. He simply watched, his eyes calm and curious, studying this strange human who was not running away or shouting orders. Daniel slowly moved closer to the edge of the gap, careful not to make any sudden movements. He noticed one of the metal plates on Drakos's side seemed loose, and beneath it, a patch of skin looked raw and irritated, like it had never healed properly. It reminded him of the medical training he once had, treating small wounds and injuries for the workers back on his home world. Without thinking too much about the danger, Daniel reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small container of medical gel, something he always carried for his own minor injuries while working. He held it up so Drakos could see it clearly, then slowly, carefully, reached his hand through the gap in the wall. The guards would have panicked if they saw this. Any other person in the fortress would have called it foolish, even suicidal. But Daniel felt no fear, only a quiet sense that this was the right thing to do. Drakos watched his hand for a long moment, his massive body completely still, as if deciding whether to trust this small, fragile creature in front of him. Then, slowly, the dragon lowered his head just enough to allow Daniel to reach the edge of the irritated skin near the loose plate. Daniel gently applied the gel, his hands steady despite his racing heart. Drakos let out a low rumble, not of anger, but almost like a sigh of relief, as the gel began to soothe the irritated area. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Drakos allowed a living being to touch him without violence. No chains were needed. No commands were given. It was simply an act of quiet kindness, offered without any expectation of reward. Daniel did not tell anyone what happened that day. He simply finished his repair work in the tunnel and walked away, leaving Drakos resting peacefully behind him. But deep inside, he knew something important had shifted, not just for the dragon, but for himself as well. He had found a strange kind of connection, one built not on power or fear, but on patience and care, and he was determined to understand it further. News of the Empire's growing troubles spread quickly through Austronvale. Scouts had reported strange machines gathering near the outer edge of the system, cold, emotionless robots that belonged to a hostile collective known simply as the Collective Swarm. These machines did not feel fear or mercy. They existed only to conquer and consume resources, and Austronvale, with its valuable fortress and strategic location, had become a clear target. Commander Threll called an emergency meeting with the fortress leaders. The Empire needed Drakos ready for battle, and they needed a rider bonded to him as soon as possible. Without a proper rider, the dragon's power could not be fully controlled during large-scale combat, and that made him a huge risk instead of a valuable weapon. A deadline was set. If no warrior could bond with Drakos within a short number of days, the leaders planned to either sedate him permanently or transport him elsewhere, away from Austronvale, treating him as a failed asset rather than a living being. Daniel heard about this deadline through gossip among the other workers in the fortress. He felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He was not a soldier and had no plans of becoming Drakos's rider. He simply wanted to help ease the dragon's pain when he could. But the thought of Drakos being sedated or shipped away like some broken machine filled him with quiet anger. 2 days after the meeting, chaos broke out in the fortress. A small group of scout drones from the Collective Swarm had somehow slipped past the outer defenses, testing the fortress's readiness before a larger attack. Alarms blared through every hallway, and the ground shook slightly from a nearby explosion. Guards rushed to their stations, and warriors grabbed their weapons, preparing for what they believed might be the beginning of a full invasion. In the panic, one of the drones crashed near Drakos's holding pen, causing part of the outer wall to crack and crumble. The impact startled Drakos, who reacted instinctively, thrashing against his restraints in fear and confusion. Metal bars bent under the pressure of his massive body, and for a moment, it looked like he might break free entirely, which would only add more chaos to an already dangerous situation. Daniel was nearby when the explosion happened, working on a different repair job close to the arena. Without thinking about his own safety, he ran toward the damaged wall, worried that Drakos might hurt himself trying to escape the confusion. Guards shouted at him to stay back, but Daniel ignored them, pushing through a gap in the broken wall and entering the enclosure just as Drakos let out a furious roar. The dragon's eyes were wild with panic, his wings flaring out, ready to strike anything that came near him. Any normal person would have turned and run immediately. But Daniel stood his ground, raising his hand slowly, showing that he carried no weapon. "Easy," Daniel said softly, his voice barely audible over the alarms still ringing throughout the fortress. "It's all right. You're safe. I'm not here to hurt you." Drakos's head swung toward him, his sharp teeth bared, smoke curling from his nostrils. For a tense moment, it seemed like the dragon might attack. But then, something changed. His eyes focused on Daniel's face, recognizing him from their quiet encounter days before in the maintenance tunnel. The wild panic in his gaze slowly faded, replaced by a cautious, uncertain calm. Daniel took a careful step forward, then another, until he stood close enough to place a gentle hand on the dragon's massive leg, right near one of the old scars he had treated before. He kept his voice low and steady, speaking simple, calming words, the same way he might comfort a frightened animal or a scared child. Slowly, Drakos's tense muscles began to relax. His wings folded back against his body, and his breathing steadied. The guards and warriors who had gathered outside the enclosure stood frozen in disbelief, watching as the untamable war dragon allowed a simple human technician to calm him down without any force, chains, or weapons involved. Commander Threll arrived just in time to witness this scene, his eyes wide with shock. He had seen countless warriors try and fail to gain even a moment of trust from Drakos. Yet here was a quiet human, someone barely noticed by anyone in the fortress, standing calmly beside the dragon's leg while gently stroking his scarred skin. The other warriors who had gathered began to whisper among themselves, some in disbelief, others in anger and jealousy. It felt insulting to them that a human, a species many of them saw as weak and unimportant, had succeeded where they had all failed. Rhodas, still recovering from his earlier injury, watched from a distance with a scowl on his face, unable to accept what he was seeing. But Daniel paid no attention to their whispers or stares. His focus remained entirely on Drakos, making sure the dragon felt safe after the chaos and confusion of the attack. As the alarms finally quieted and the drones were cleared away by the fortress defenses, Daniel remained by Drakos' side, refusing to leave until he was certain the dragon was truly calm. Commander Threll approached slowly, careful not to startle either of them. "You may have just done what none of our warriors could," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and confusion. "The Empire is going to want answers, and probably more than that." Daniel looked up at him, still resting his hand gently on Drakos' leg. "I'm not here to be his rider," he said simply. "I just didn't want to see him hurt." Commander Threll studied him for a long moment, unsure of what to say next. Whatever happened from this point forward, one thing was now certain. Everything the fortress believed about bonding with Drakos was about to be challenged. Word of what happened during the attack spread through Austronvale faster than any official announcement could. By the next morning, nearly everyone in the fortress had heard some version of the story, though many of them exaggerated the details, making Daniel sound either like a secret hero or a lucky fool who had simply not been eaten. Daniel himself tried to avoid all the attention, continuing his repair work as if nothing unusual had happened, but it became harder and harder to ignore the stares and whispers that followed him through the hallways. Commander Threll requested a private meeting with Daniel later that day, away from the noisy crowds and curious eyes. The meeting took place in a small office filled with old maps and reports, the same kind of quiet, forgotten space where Daniel had first learned about Drakos' painful past. "The Council wants you to formally bond with Drakos," Threll said, getting straight to the point. "They believe you may be the only chance we have of controlling him before the collective swarm launches a full attack." Daniel frowned slightly, shaking his head. "I don't want to control him," he said. "That's the whole problem, isn't it? Everyone before me tried to control him, to own him, to use him as a tool. That's why he never trusted anyone." Threll leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel carefully. "The Empire does not have the luxury of patience right now. We need a weapon ready for war." "He's not a weapon," Daniel replied firmly, surprising even himself with the strength in his voice. "He's alive. He feels pain, fear, and yes, maybe even trust, if given the chance. If you force this bond the way you forced it before, you'll break whatever small trust I've managed to build with him." Threll fell silent for a moment, clearly frustrated but also unable to argue with what he had witnessed the day before. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Very well. We will allow you to continue on your own terms, for now. But know this, the deadline set by the Council still stands. If Drakos is not ready to fight when the collective swarm arrives in full force, both you and he may be removed from Austronvale entirely." Daniel accepted these terms, understanding the risk but unwilling to change his approach. Over the following days, he spent every free moment he had near Drakos' enclosure, sometimes simply sitting quietly nearby, other times gently treating small wounds or scars that still bothered the dragon. He never gave commands. He never tried to ride him or control his movements. He simply offered his presence, patience, and care. Slowly, Drakos began to respond in small but meaningful ways. He would lower his head when Daniel approached, allowing him closer without any tension. Sometimes, he would let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a cat's purr, whenever Daniel treated one of his old scars. Once, when a loud noise startled Daniel from a nearby explosion during a training drill, Drakos instinctively moved his massive body between Daniel and the source of the noise, shielding him without being asked. These small moments meant more to Daniel than any grand gesture could. He realized that Drakos was not simply obeying him out of fear or training. He was choosing to protect him out of something closer to genuine care, a bond built entirely on trust rather than commands. Not everyone in the fortress shared Daniel's patience or understanding. However, Rhodus, still bitter about his earlier failure and humiliated by Daniel's success, began spreading rumors among the other warriors, claiming that the human was using some kind of hidden trick or unfair advantage. He argued loudly during meetings that Drakos needed a true warrior as his rider, someone who could lead him properly into battle, not a weak technician who barely knew how to fight. Some of the other warriors agreed with Rhodus, feeling insulted that a human had succeeded where their entire species had failed. Tension grew within the fortress, adding extra pressure on both Daniel and Commander Threll, who found himself caught between following council orders and defending an approach he did not fully understand but could not deny was working. Despite the growing hostility, Daniel remained focused on his quiet routine with Drakos, refusing to let the whispers and jealousy distract him. Each day, he learned more about the dragon's behavior, understanding the subtle differences between a warning growl and a comforting one, learning which areas of his body were still sensitive from old wounds, and slowly building a form of communication that went beyond simple words. Then, on a quiet evening, as Daniel sat beside Drakos cleaning a small cut near his wing, alarms suddenly blared throughout the fortress once again, this time far louder and more urgent than before. Reports came flooding in from the outer defense stations. The collective swarm was no longer testing the fortress's defenses. This time, they were launching a full-scale attack. Daniel felt his heart race as he looked up at Drakos, whose orange eyes had already turned toward the sound of the alarms, his body tensing with readiness. For the first time since their bond began, both of them understood that the moment of true challenge had finally arrived, and there was no more time left to prepare. The sky above Vale turned a sickly shade of green as hundreds of collective swarm ships descended toward the fortress, their metal hulls gleaming under the dim evening light. Explosions rocked the outer walls, and defense cannons fired endlessly into the darkening sky, trying to hold back the massive wave of machines closing in on their position. Screams and shouted orders filled the air as soldiers scrambled to their stations, preparing for what many feared might be the fortress's final battle. Daniel stood beside Drakos' enclosure, watching as the guards struggled to open the heavy gates, allowing the dragon to move freely for the first time since the attack began. Commander Threll rushed toward them, his face covered in dust and sweat, shouting over the noise of battle. "We need him in the air now," Threll said urgently. "The other warriors and their partial bonded creatures are barely holding the eastern wall. If it falls, the entire fortress could be overrun within the hour." Daniel nodded, turning to face Drakos, who stood tall and tense, his massive wings already spread wide, ready for flight. There was no time for hesitation. Daniel climbed onto the dragon's back, not as a rider giving commands, but as a partner trusting in their bond. He held on tightly to a natural ridge along Drakos' neck, careful to avoid any of his healing scars. "Let's go," Daniel said simply, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. With a powerful beat of his wings, Drakos launched into the sky, faster and more graceful than anyone had ever seen him move before. The wind roared past Daniel's ears as they soared above the battlefield, revealing the true scale of the attack. Dozens of collective swarm machines swarmed over the eastern wall, their weapons firing endless streams of energy at the defenders below. Drakos let out a powerful roar, a sound that shook the very air around them, before diving down toward the enemy machines. Flames erupted from his mouth, burning through metal and circuits with ease, scattering the machines like leaves in a storm. Daniel held on tightly, guiding him gently with soft words and light touches rather than harsh commands, trusting Drakos to use his own strength and instincts in battle. Unlike previous attempts by other warriors, who had tried to force Drakos into rigid battle formations or specific attack patterns, Daniel simply let him fight the way he wanted, offering guidance only when necessary. This freedom seemed to unlock something powerful within Drakos, a fierce determination fueled not by fear of punishment, but by genuine loyalty toward the human who had shown him kindness. As the battle raged on, Rhodus, still eager to prove himself despite his earlier failures, spotted an opportunity. Believing that Drakos' power should belong to a true warrior rather than a weak human technician, he charged forward on his own creature, attempting to force Drakos into submission mid-battle, hoping to seize control for himself in front of the other warriors. "Move aside," Rhodus shouted, attempting to grab hold of Drakos' reins as they landed briefly near the eastern wall to clear out another wave of enemy machines. "This is no place for a coward hiding behind a beast he does not deserve." Drakos reacted instantly, swinging his massive tail and knocking Rhodus completely off his feet, sending him crashing into a nearby wall. His fierce eyes locked onto the warrior with a warning growl, clearly showing that he would not tolerate any attempt at forced control, especially not during such a critical moment. The message was clear to everyone watching. Drakos' loyalty could not be taken by force. It had to be earned. The battle continued for what felt like hours, with Daniel and Drakos working together seamlessly, turning the tide against the relentless waves of collective swarm machines. Just as it seemed like victory might finally be within reach, a massive enemy cruiser broke through the fortress's outer defenses, firing a powerful energy blast directly toward a group of retreating soldiers and civilians who had been unable to reach safety in time. Without hesitation, Daniel shouted for Drakos to move, but in his urgency to protect the group below, he lost his balance and fell from the dragon's back, crashing hard onto the battlefield below. Pain shot through his side as he tried to stand, but his leg had been injured in the fall, making it impossible to move quickly enough to escape the incoming blast. Drakos saw what happened and let out a furious, desperate roar unlike anything heard before. Ignoring his own safety, he dove toward Daniel, positioning his massive body directly between the incoming energy blast and the fallen human. The explosion hit Drakos' side with tremendous force, knocking him back, but his thick scales absorbed most of the damage, protecting both Daniel and the group of civilians who had been in danger. As the smoke cleared, Drakos slowly turned his head, checking on Daniel with worried, gentle eyes, nudging him carefully with his snout to make sure he was still breathing. Despite his own injuries, his first instinct had been to protect the human who had shown him nothing but kindness and patience. The other warriors and soldiers who witnessed this moment stood in stunned silence, finally understanding what Daniel had known all along. This was not simply a weapon following orders. This was a true bond, built on trust and mutual protection, proving stronger in that single moment than any forced control could ever hope to achieve. Smoke still hung low over Ostrenvale 2 days after the battle ended, but beneath the gray haze, the fortress buzzed with a different kind of energy, one filled with relief, recovery, and quiet celebration. The collective swarm had finally retreated after suffering heavy losses, forced back by the combined efforts of the fortress's defenders, with Drakos and Daniel's actions marking the turning point that saved countless lives. Daniel woke up in the fortress medical bay, his leg wrapped tightly in a healing brace, sharp pain still lingering from his fall during the battle. Beside his bed, through a large window designed for observing patients, he could see part of the outer courtyard where Drakos rested, his massive body covered in bandages from the injuries he took protecting Daniel and the group of civilians. A nurse gently checked on Daniel's condition, informing him that he would need at least another week of rest before his leg fully healed. Despite the pain, Daniel felt oddly at peace, his mind replaying the moment Drakos had thrown himself into danger without hesitation, choosing to protect him over his own safety. Commander Threll visited later that day, looking far less tired than before, though his uniform was still torn and dirty from the battle. He pulled a chair beside Daniel's bed and sat down heavily, letting out a long breath. "You should know," Threll began. "Word of what happened here has already reached the higher council. Reports of a human forming an unbreakable bond with Drakos, without force, without domination, simply through patience and care, it is spreading quickly across allied worlds." Daniel shrugged slightly, wincing from the movement. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said honestly. "I just wanted to help him." Threll allowed a small, tired smile. "That is exactly why it worked, and exactly why the Empire needs to rethink how we approach every bonded warrior and creature from now on. Your actions may end up changing centuries of tradition." Over the following weeks, as both Daniel and Drakos slowly recovered from their injuries, the fortress leadership began reconsidering their entire training program. Reports were sent throughout the empire, detailing how forced dominance and control had failed for generations, while a simple approach built on patience, respect, and genuine care had succeeded where countless warriors before had not. Rhodus, humbled by his repeated failures and the embarrassment of his attempted power grab during the battle, eventually approached Daniel privately, offering a stiff but sincere apology. He admitted that he had been wrong to judge Daniel based on his species alone, acknowledging that true strength was not always about physical power or aggression. Daniel accepted the apology graciously, showing no bitterness or desire for revenge. Instead, he simply asked Rhodus to consider treating his own bonded creature with more patience and kindness in the future, a suggestion Rhodus took seriously after witnessing firsthand what such an approach could accomplish. As for Drakos, his physical wounds healed steadily under proper care, but it was the deeper, older scars, the ones caused by years of abuse and control long before Austronvale existed, that finally began to fade as well. For the first time in his long life, Drakos experienced something other than fear or obligation from those around him. He experienced genuine companionship. Daniel often visited him during his recovery, sometimes simply sitting beside him in comfortable silence, other times gently treating the last remaining scars along his side. Drakos, in turn, grew more relaxed and playful in ways no one in the fortress had ever witnessed before, occasionally nudging Daniel affectionately or letting out soft, content rumbles whenever he approached. Eventually, the council offered Daniel an official position within the fortress, along with honors and titles befitting his newfound status as Drakos's true bonded partner. However, Daniel turned down most of the grand titles and ceremonies offered to him, choosing instead to remain a simple technician who happened to share a deep bond with the Empire's most powerful war dragon. "I don't need a title to know what we have," he told Commander Threll during their final meeting on the matter. "I just want to make sure he's taken care of properly this time." Months later, as Austronvale continued rebuilding and strengthening its defenses against future threats from the collective swarm, a new sight became common around the fortress. Daniel and Drakos could often be seen together near the fortress gates, sometimes training in the open fields nearby, other times simply resting together after a long day. Alien warriors and soldiers, who once mocked Daniel for his quiet, unassuming nature, now watched him with newfound respect, understanding that true strength did not always come from brute force or aggression. Sometimes, it came from patience, kindness, and the simple willingness to see beyond old wounds and painful pasts. As the sun set over Austronvale one peaceful evening, casting warm colors across the fortress walls, Daniel sat beside Drakos near the outer gates, watching the horizon together in comfortable silence. Whatever challenges awaited them in the future, whether new battles against the collective swarm or other unknown threats across the galaxy, one thing remained certain. Their bond, built not on fear or control, but on trust and genuine care, would carry them through it all, standing as proof that even the deepest scars could heal, given enough patience and compassion.